Malik tossed and turned in his bed, struggling to find a comfortable position to finally drift off. As he pulled the covers over his head, hoping to shut out the lingering thoughts about the math test tomorrow, he heard a faint, unusual sound coming from the other side of the wall. The thin, almost inaudible sound floated down the hallway, growing clearer as he lay completely still, his senses tuned to every noise in the silence of the night. It was his little sister, Zuri. She was crying. At first, Malik tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination. Maybe she had a nightmare, or perhaps he was just hearing things. But each night, like clockwork, the sobbing returned. And each night, Malik lay awake, listening, his heart pounding with worry. The sound wasn't just sad, it was gut-wrenching, as if it was coming from a place of deep pain, something too heavy for an 8-year-old to carry alone. By morning, the sound had stopped, and so had Malik's ability to pretend everything was fine. In the bright morning light, however, things felt different. Zuri seemed to be herself mostly. She still had that familiar sparkle in her eye and greeted Malik with her usual cheerful, "Good morning." But he noticed that something was different about her demeanor. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes and she seemed distracted, like she was holding on to a secret. Malik watched as she sat quietly at the breakfast table, stirring her cereal absent-mindedly, the clinking of her spoon rhythmic and slow. As Malik watched her, questions circled in his mind. Why was she crying? Was someone bothering her at school? Was she having nightmares? Malik knew his sister well. Zuri had always been the happiest, most joyful person he knew. She'd laugh over the silliest things, always quick to find joy in even the smallest moments. So the idea of her crying alone in her room felt deeply wrong, like seeing a familiar painting with colors all out of place. That night, Malik lay in bed once more, straining to hear the faintest sound. When the crying began again, it was quiet, almost muffled, as if Zuri were burying her face in her pillow. Malik's heart twisted. He knew he couldn't just ignore it, but he didn't know what to say either. As her older brother, he felt it was his job to protect her, to make sure nothing could hurt her. But how could he protect her from something he didn't understand? He felt helpless, frustrated, and guilty all at once. The next morning, Malik decided to try talking to her, hoping maybe she'd open up if he showed her he cared. He waited until they were alone in the living room after breakfast, the sunlight streaming through the curtains, casting soft golden light across the room. Zuri was curled up on the couch, a book in her lap, but Malik could tell she wasn't really reading. She was staring at the page, her eyes distant. "Hey, Zuri," Malik began, trying to sound casual. "You've been kind of quiet lately. Everything okay?" Zuri looked up, surprised, and for a moment, Malik saw a flash of fear in her eyes. But it vanished quickly, replaced by a smile that felt a little too forced. "Yeah, I'm fine, Malik," she replied, her voice light, but her gaze evasive. "Just a bit tired, I guess." Malik knew she was lying. He could see it in the way she avoided his gaze, in the way she quickly turned back to her book. But he didn't want to push her. Instead, he just nodded, pretending to believe her, even though every instinct told him something was wrong. Deep down, he felt an urge to press harder, to demand answers. But he held back, worried that it might make her retreat even further. Days turned into a week, and each night the crying continued. Malik tried everything he could think of to get to the bottom of it. He watched her closely, paying attention to the smallest changes in her behavior. He noticed that she'd grown quieter, often lost in her own thoughts. She used to spend hours playing with her dolls or laughing at cartoons, but now she seemed almost ghost-like, moving through the day as if in a daze. At school, things weren't much different. Malik saw her during lunch, sitting alone instead of with her usual group of friends. She stared down at her food, picking at it absent-mindedly, her eyes vacant. Malik's worry deepened. Zuri had always been popular, the kind of kid everyone wanted to be around because of her infectious energy. But now it was like a shadow had fallen over her. Desperation gnawed at Malik. He tried asking their mom, hoping she might know something. That night, as he helped his mom with the dishes, he brought it up as casually as he could manage. "Hey, Mom," he said, keeping his tone light, "have you noticed anything different about Zuri?" His mom barely looked up from the sink, her hands busy scrubbing a stubborn stain off a plate. "She's probably just going through a phase," she replied with a dismissive wave. You know how kids are. She'll be fine. Malik felt a pang of frustration. How could she be so dismissive? Zuri wasn't just going through a phase. This was different. This was serious. But he didn't push it. He knew his mom was busy, working extra shifts to make ends meet, but still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't something he should ignore. That night, Malik made a decision. If no one else was going to help Zuri, he would. He waited until everyone was asleep, then quietly crept out of his room and positioned himself outside her door. His heart pounded as he listened, straining his ears for any sound. Minutes ticked by, and just as he was beginning to think she'd fallen asleep peacefully, he heard it, the faint, heartbreaking sound of her sobs. It felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. He wanted to burst into the room, to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay. But he knew she'd shut down if he confronted her directly. Instead, he decided he'd find another way to get through to her. If talking to her directly wouldn't work, maybe he could piece together what was bothering her by being observant, by paying attention to the details no one else noticed. The next few days were a blur of quiet observations. Malik shadowed Zuri as much as he could, noticing things he hadn't before. Her fingers twitched nervously whenever someone approached her too suddenly. She seemed jumpy, always looking over her shoulder as if she were afraid someone was watching her. She kept her head down in class, avoided eye contact, and seemed to flinch at even the softest of sounds. With each passing day, Malik's concern deepened. He could feel the frustration mounting, the helplessness gnawing at him. He didn't just want answers. He needed them. He hated seeing his sister like this, hurting and alone, with no one to lean on. He began to lose sleep, staying up each night to listen for her crying, hoping it would stop, praying for a sign that things were getting better. But the crying never stopped, and neither did Malik's growing sense of dread. The breaking point came one night when Zuri's sobs turned into soft, desperate pleas. Please, don't stop. The words were barely audible, but Malik heard them as clearly as if she'd shouted them. His blood ran cold. There was something more to this than he'd realized, something that made his stomach churn with fear. He knew then that this wasn't something he could handle alone. Whatever was happening to Zuri, it was too big for him to solve on his own. He needed help, real help, and as he lay there staring up at the ceiling, he made up his mind. Tomorrow he'd take the first step toward finding out the truth. Even if it meant breaking every rule in the book, he was going to make sure his sister didn't have to face this alone. The next day, Malik woke up with a single purpose. He was going to find out what was wrong with Zuri, no matter what. He kept replaying the fragmented cries and whispers he'd heard the night before. He could still hear her desperate plea, the faint, please don't, looping over in his mind. As he watched Zuri pick at her breakfast across the table, looking smaller and more withdrawn than ever, he knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He decided he needed a plan. If he was going to get to the bottom of this, he'd have to be smart about it. Throughout the day, Malik began noting the smaller things he hadn't noticed before. Zuri's shoulders seemed to tense every time a loud noise erupted in the school hallways. She avoided anyone who tried to talk to her, always keeping her head down, her fingers fidgeting nervously. She was like a shadow of her former self, and Malik's heart ached watching her shrink into herself more each day. During lunch, Malik sat at the far end of the cafeteria, keeping an eye on Zuri from across the room. He noticed she barely touched her food, just as she had at home, instead gazing out the window with a distant, almost hollow expression. It was then that Malik saw his chance. One of Zuri's friends, Kayla, was sitting a few seats away, chatting with some other girls. Kayla and Zuri had been best friends since kindergarten. Malik figured if anyone knew what was going on with his sister, it would be her. He waited until Kayla was alone, heading back to the classroom after lunch. Gathering his courage, he approached her with a friendly smile, hoping he didn't seem too pushy. Hey, Kayla, he greeted her as casually as he could. Do you have a minute? Kayla looked up, her eyebrows raising in mild surprise. She wasn't used to Malik talking to her like this, especially about something as serious as Zuri. Sure, Malik. What's up? Taking a deep breath, Malik decided to be honest. I'm worried about Zuri. She's been acting really strange lately. She doesn't talk much, and Well, I think something might be bothering her. Have you noticed anything? Kayla's face softened, and she looked down, clearly thinking. She took a moment, then sighed. Yeah, actually, I have noticed. She's been kind of different. She used to tell me everything, you know? She hesitated, glancing down the hall, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. But lately, she's been quiet and she barely wants to hang out. Malik felt a pang of relief mixed with concern. At least he wasn't imagining it. Do you think, do you think someone's been bothering her? He searched Kayla's face for any sign of understanding. Kayla hesitated again, her face troubled. I don't know. She hasn't said anything specific, but last week, she mentioned something weird. I didn't think much of it then, but now that you're saying all this, her voice trailed off and Malik leaned in, urging her to continue. She told me she was scared to walk home alone. I thought maybe it was because of all the stuff going on in the news, you know, people getting hurt and stuff, Kayla said, shifting uncomfortably. But maybe there's something else. I mean, I know her parents are always home, but you think something's happening at school? Malik's mind raced. It hadn't even crossed his mind that something at school could be bothering her. But now that Kayla mentioned it, he wondered if maybe she was being bullied or harassed. It wouldn't explain everything, but it was a start. Thanks, Kayla, Malik said, his tone serious. If you hear anything else, or if she says anything, will you let me know? Kayla nodded, giving him a small, worried smile. Of course, Malik, I'm worried too. I'll keep an eye on her. With a bit more information, but still no concrete answers, Malik felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't sure what he was going to do yet, but he knew he had to keep digging. Something was bothering his sister, and he was getting closer to finding out what it was. That night, Malik waited until everyone was asleep and crept out of his room again. This time, he was going to try something different. He was going to confront her gently and see if she'd open up to him. He had to be careful, he reminded himself. One wrong word, and she might close herself off even more. Malik made his way to Zuri's room, hesitating for a moment before gently tapping on the door. He half expected her to be asleep, but the light under the door told him otherwise. Slowly, he opened it and saw her sitting on her bed, hugging her knees, her face wet with fresh tears. Zuri, he whispered, stepping into the room, careful not to startle her. Her eyes shot up, wide with surprise, but Malik held up his hands in a reassuring gesture. Hey, it's just me, he said softly, sitting down next to her on the bed. I couldn't sleep, and I noticed you've been upset lately. Do you want to talk about it? Zuri stared at him, her eyes shimmering with unspoken emotions, and for a moment he thought she was going to open up. But then she shook her head, wiping her eyes. I'm fine, Malik. Really. Her words were forced, the tremor in her voice betraying her. Malik felt his heart sink, knowing she was still holding back. But he couldn't push her, not if he wanted her to trust him. Instead, he reached over, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. Zuri, whatever's bothering you, just know that you're not alone, he whispered, his voice soft and full of sincerity. I'm here for you, okay? Whenever you're ready, you can tell me. She looked up at him with a mix of gratitude and pain, and for a brief moment, she nodded as if to acknowledge his words. Malik squeezed her shoulder, offering her as much comfort as he could before leaving the room. Back in his own bed, he lay awake, hoping that maybe, just maybe, Zuri would feel safe enough to confide in him soon. But until then, he would keep listening, keep watching, and keep being there for her. He wasn't giving up, not until he got to the bottom of it all. The following day, Malik woke up feeling drained but resolute. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was troubling Zuri was escalating. Her reaction last night had convinced him. She was hiding something big, and her fear was too intense for it to be something minor. Malik was determined to piece together any clues he could find, even if it meant keeping an even closer eye on her. At school, he continued observing her as discreetly as possible, hoping for any indication of what might be causing her anxiety. By lunchtime, though, he hadn't noticed anything unusual. No one seemed to be bothering her directly, but Malik saw her continue to avoid people, walking with her head down, eyes trained on the floor. It was as though she was trying to disappear. After school, Malik made his way to the library, a place he'd often visited with Zuri in the past. He remembered how much she used to love reading, spending hours in the cozy children's section with stacks of books. Now, though, the thought of Zuri's changed demeanor weighed heavily on him. Sitting at a table by himself, Malik opened his notebook, jotting down everything he'd observed about her behavior. It was then that an idea struck him. If he couldn't get Zuri to open up to him directly, maybe he could get more insight by looking around her room. He felt guilty even thinking about it, invading her privacy like that. But he was desperate for answers. He knew that Zuri wouldn't leave anything obvious lying around. But perhaps there'd be something subtle, a clue, a hint, that might explain the fear and sadness haunting her. That evening, he waited until their parents were busy preparing dinner, then carefully slipped into Zuri's room. He looked around, trying to avoid disturbing anything too obviously. Her room was as neatly kept as ever, her desk tidy, her books lined up in alphabetical order. Everything seemed ordinary at first, but Malik noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper under her pillow. Heart pounding, he reached out and gently unfolded it. The note was hastily written, the words scrawled in Zuri's handwriting. "Please make it stop. I can't take it anymore. I don't feel safe here." A chill ran down Malik's spine as he read the words over and over. This wasn't just a random note. This was a cry for help, a desperate plea that seemed to confirm his worst fears. His mind raced with questions. Who was making her feel unsafe? And how had he missed the signs for so long? Taking a deep breath, Malik folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, determined to figure out what was behind his sister's suffering. He didn't know if it was a bully, a teacher, or something even worse, but he was going to find out. That night, Malik lay in bed, wide awake, replaying everything in his mind. The pieces still didn't fit, but he was closer now than ever. Just then he heard the faint sound of Zuri crying again, her sobs muffled by the walls. Each tearful gasp tore at him, but he resisted the urge to rush to her room. He had a feeling that pressing her too soon might scare her off. Instead, he decided to wait and try a new approach the next day. The following morning, Malik was prepared. After breakfast, he found Zuri in the living room, her usual quiet self, and sat down next to her. "Zuri," he began gently, hoping his tone would show her he meant no harm. "I found something in your room. A note. I'm not mad or anything. I'm just really worried about you. You're my sister, and I want to help." At first, she looked horrified, her face paling as she realized he'd read her private thoughts. But as she met his eyes, the weight of her fear and sadness seemed to crack through her walls. Slowly, she lowered her gaze, her fingers nervously picking at her shirt. "I'm scared, Malik," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. Malik nodded, encouraging her to go on without pushing too hard. "Every night," Zuri continued, her voice trembling, "I feel like someone's watching me. I see shadows, hear strange noises outside my window. I thought it was just my imagination at first, but it's been happening so much. I'm scared to tell anyone because I don't want them to think I'm crazy." Malik's heart sank. He had no idea she'd been carrying such a burden, alone and terrified. Taking her hand in his, he gave her a reassuring squeeze. "Zuri, you're not crazy," he said firmly, "and you don't have to face this alone. I believe you." She looked at him, her expression softening, as if his words had finally lifted a small part of the weight she'd been carrying. "I tried to ignore it," she confessed, her voice breaking. "But the other night, someone actually knocked on my window. I thought it was just a prank, but now, every sound, every shadow, it's like they're taunting me." Malik felt a surge of protectiveness. Whoever was behind this was going to regret ever laying a hand on his sister. He wrapped an arm around her shoulder, offering her as much comfort as he could. "Listen, I'm going to help you. We're going to figure this out together, okay? But first, I'm going to talk to Mom and Dad. We have to let them know what's going on." Zuri looked hesitant, but Malik gave her an encouraging nod. "They'll understand, Zuri. They love you just like I do, and they'll want to keep you safe." That night, as Malik prepared to talk to their parents, he steeled himself for the conversation. He knew it was going to be tough, but he was ready to do whatever it took to protect Zuri. She deserved peace, safety, and love, and he wasn't going to stop until she had all three. That evening, as Malik approached his parents in the living room, he took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. Zuri was hiding upstairs, still nervous about what their parents might think of her confession. But Malik was determined to help them understand the gravity of her situation. His parents looked up from their reading as he entered, their faces curious but patient, ready to listen. Malik sat down, and after a pause, he began to explain everything. He told them about Zuri's strange behavior over the past few weeks, her reluctance to speak up, the mysterious sounds and shadows, and the note he'd found. Both his parents listened intently, their faces shifting from curiosity to deep concern as Malik continued. So, Zuri's been terrified for weeks, he concluded, his voice steady. And I think whatever's happening, it's been getting worse. She feels like she's being watched. And last night, she said someone knocked on her window. She's too afraid to sleep, and she doesn't feel safe in her own room. Malik's mother placed a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with worry. His father, who was usually calm and rational, looked shaken. He exchanged a look with Malik's mom, then turned back to Malik with a grave expression. "Thank you for telling us, son," he said quietly. "I had no idea she was going through this. We need to handle this carefully so she feels safe and supported." "Absolutely," Malik's mom added, her voice filled with conviction. "We'll make sure she knows she's not alone. This is her home, and we're going to make sure she feels safe here." Together, they decided it was best for Zuri to stay with Malik in his room for the time being. They'd also put up a security camera outside her window and another near the front door to catch any suspicious activity. Malik's dad, determined to handle the situation, agreed to contact the police for advice on how to address the strange knocks and unsettling shadows that had plagued Zuri for so long. Later that night, as Malik led Zuri into his room, he could see relief mixed with anxiety in her eyes. She'd overheard part of the conversation with their parents and knew they were taking her concerns seriously. "Thank you, Malik," she whispered, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I was so scared no one would believe me." Malik sat beside her, putting a reassuring arm around her shoulders. "Hey, we're in this together. You don't have to face any of this alone anymore." As Zuri settled in, she seemed more relaxed than she had in days, even managing a small smile as they talked. Malik told her funny stories from school, trying to lighten the mood and keep her mind off her fears. He felt a renewed sense of determination. They were a team now, and he would do whatever it took to help her feel safe again. But as the night wore on, a strange unease settled over him. He'd promised to stay awake and watch over Zuri, but the steady rhythm of her breathing as she drifted off made him drowsy. Before he knew it, he'd nodded off beside her, the weight of the day's events finally catching up with him. Sometime in the dead of night, a faint tapping sound echoed from down the hall. Malik's eyes flew open, his heart racing as he looked around in the darkness. Zuri was still asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in days. Malik sat up, straining to listen. The tapping sound grew louder, and then footsteps. He held his breath, his muscles tense as he crept toward his bedroom door. Opening it just a crack, he peeked into the hallway. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, as if they were waiting for something to happen. But as he squinted into the darkness, the footsteps stopped, and the house fell silent once more. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Slowly, he closed the door and locked it, just to be safe. But even with the door locked, he felt exposed. Whoever or whatever had been causing Zuri's fear seemed closer than ever. The next morning, Malik shared what he'd heard with his parents, who were already on high alert. His dad, visibly worried, decided to review the security footage they'd set up the night before. Malik sat with him, watching the screen intently. But to their surprise, the footage revealed nothing out of the ordinary. No mysterious figures, no shadows near Zuri's window. The cameras had recorded only empty hallways and the quiet of the night. Zuri's fears weren't imaginary. Malik knew that much. But the lack of evidence was frustrating. He felt as though they were playing a game with a ghost that left no trace, a nightmare that faded with the dawn. Determined not to let their lack of evidence stop them, Malik's dad decided to reach out to the police for an official report. Officer Martinez, a tall, soft-spoken man with a reputation for thoroughness, arrived later that day. He took careful notes as he listened to their story, his expression thoughtful but sympathetic. "I know it might feel like there's no evidence right now," Officer Martinez said, "but it doesn't mean nothing's happening. I've seen situations where people were harassed in ways that left almost no trace. We'll keep an eye on things, and I'll ask the neighbors if they've noticed anything suspicious." Malik's mom thanked him, her relief evident. After the officer left, Malik looked at Zuri, who seemed to have regained some of her strength. "See," he said, smiling gently, "you're not alone, Zuri. We're all here for you." The days passed with relative calm. Zuri's fears seemed to lessen with the support of her family, and Malik noticed her smile return little by little. For the first time in weeks, she was laughing again, playing with her friends outside, and even staying up with Malik to watch movies without looking over her shoulder every few minutes. But Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking beneath the surface. He continued to listen at night, ready to protect her at the slightest hint of danger. And though he hoped it was over, he knew that if the threat returned, they were now prepared, together. As the calm days passed, Malik's sense of unease never fully left. Although Zuri appeared more at ease, he remained vigilant, keeping watch over her each night. The memory of the eerie footsteps and the silent, invisible threat still lingered, and he felt a persistent weight in his chest, a fear that the peace might not last. One night, just as he was about to drift off to sleep, Malik heard it again. A faint tapping sound. His heart jolted and he sat up, listening intently. The tapping was soft, deliberate, and coming from Zuri's room down the hall. He glanced at his clock. 2:18 a.m. He slipped out of bed, his pulse racing, and tiptoed down the hall, determined to confront whatever or whoever was causing Zuri such fear. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly pushed open Zuri's door. Inside, the room was cloaked in darkness. He squinted, waiting for his eyes to adjust. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he saw Zuri's small figure, sitting up in bed, staring at the window, her eyes wide with fear. Her gaze was fixed on something outside, but when Malik turned to look, he saw only the shadows of the night. "Zuri," he whispered, moving toward her. "What's wrong?" It's outside again," she whispered, barely audible. "The knocking, it never stops." Just as she said it, the sound came again, more distinct this time, a soft, persistent tapping. Malik felt a chill run down his spine as he stood protectively in front of Zuri, his eyes locked on the window. Suddenly he saw it, a dark, shadowy figure moving slowly along the side of the house. Malik's first instinct was to shout, to call his parents. But then he thought of something else, a plan he'd come up with in case he ever saw this shadow again. "Stay here," he whispered to Zuri, grabbing his phone. "I'm going to scare them off." Zuri's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded, trusting him. Malik turned and slipped out of her room, making his way down the hall to his parents' room. He gently woke his father and told him about the shadow outside. His father's face hardened with determination as he grabbed his phone and followed Malik back to Zuri's room. Together they peered through the window, watching as the shadowy figure lingered just outside, hidden by the shadows of the trees. Malik's father quickly dialed 911, reporting the suspicious activity, but the figure seemed to sense something was amiss. It moved quickly, disappearing into the darkness before they could identify who or what it was. By the time the police arrived, the shadow was gone, leaving only Malik's family in a sense of lingering dread in its wake. Officer Martinez, the same officer who had visited them before, listened carefully to their account and took detailed notes. He assured them that patrol cars would be monitoring the area regularly. But as they stood outside, staring into the shadows, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that the threat was far from over. He glanced at Zuri, who clung to their mother's side, her face pale but resolute. "Don't worry, Zuri," he said softly. "I won't let anyone scare you again." In the following days, Malik's family implemented more security measures around the house. Additional cameras were installed, motion-activated lights lined the perimeter, and their father even arranged for a local security company to drive by periodically. Despite these precautions, Zuri's fears didn't disappear completely. Some nights, she still woke up crying, and Malik would sit with her, telling her stories to help her feel safe. As time passed, they both learned to adapt, finding strength in each other and their family. And then, one evening, just as the sun was setting, there was a knock on the door. Malik's mother opened it to find Officer Martinez, his expression somber yet hopeful. He had come to share some news. "We may have found the person who's been causing trouble," he said, his gaze steady. "It seems that someone in the neighborhood was going through a tough time and had been dealing with personal issues. They admitted to loitering outside homes and knocking on windows, though they claimed it was all a misunderstanding. Regardless, they're now receiving help." Relief washed over Malik and his family. It wasn't a supernatural force or some untraceable threat. It was just a person who needed support. But the experience had brought them closer, teaching them the value of trust and the strength that comes from facing fears together. That night, as Malik and Zuri sat on the porch, looking out at the stars, he smiled at her, knowing that they'd both emerge stronger from the ordeal. "Remember, Zuri," he said, his voice gentle, "no matter what happens, we're family. We'll always protect each other." Zuri smiled, her eyes reflecting the starlight, finally at peace.